SLU law professor Greg Willard is here in studio to talk about a number of things. We haven't had a chance to talk with you since the election, and we thought today being Electoral College Day, getting more attention than it normally does. We can have a conversation with a lawyer who we trust, who will spin us incorrectly, but at least we trust the man. Greg Willard, welcome back, Big 550 KTRS.
Good to be back, McGraw.
All right, let's have a little history lesson here, but let's start at the beginning. The Founding Fathers put in the Electoral College because, was it true they were afraid that the people were not smart enough to vote for a president themselves?
They were afraid, McGraw, that there might be instances where the passion of the body politic, the emotions or other incentives would lead to a bad result in the popular vote, and they created this body known as the Electoral College.
Sounds to me like this is a perfect scenario, which is what many Hillary Clinton supporters are saying. This is a perfect scenario. A man who brags about not wanting to read the daily briefings, promoted a foreign entity to hack into our government, to do all sorts of things that are out of the norm. Sounds to me like this is a perfect example of what the Founding Fathers were afraid of.
You have articulated well the views of the so-called Hamilton electors.
Yes.
Let me see if I can set the stage for us a little bit. The idea, I think most would agree, that the framers of the Constitution set forth was that the Electoral College, and specifically the electors, would be a deliberative body.
Okay.
And that they would have a degree of independence from the voters. You can read the writings of Alexander Hamilton. In fact, there's a Supreme Court case where Justice Story commented on it. What has happened is, through an evolution over the decades, it has gone from a deliberative body, McGraw, to pretty much a rubber stamp.
Right.
The reason is that the Constitution that sets up the Electoral College says that the method by which electors are to be picked shall be established by the state legislatures. And what the state legislatures have largely done in the decades since, and currently is in place today, is they defer to the political parties. And it's the political parties who effectively appoint the electors.
Right.
Now, you could make the case, and it has happened 157 times in United States history, that an elector will be a faithless elector, or they will go rogue and vote for someone other than the candidate who carried the popular vote in their state. That has been an effort by Professor Lessig at Harvard and others to try to convince 38, I think it is what Mrs. Clinton needs, 38 Trump electors today to become Hamilton electors or faithless electors, and to have the 38 Trump electors change and vote for Clinton.
There have been a couple of Republican electors, I think one down in Texas, who has said, I cannot in good conscience vote for Donald Trump.
There's one in Texas, and so he will become number 158.
Right.
But Mr. Trump has 302 electoral votes. All he needs is 269, because that would be a tie, which would send the contest to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he would win. Mrs. Clinton, on the other hand, she needs 270.
Right.
So she and her supporters would have to flip, whatever the math comes to, 34 Trump electors today. And as you say, quite correctly, McGraw, there is one individual, a Trump elector in Texas, who says he's not going to vote for Trump.
Was there not a law passed that said if they take an oath, right, these electors, but do they, because didn't I read that there was a law that passed that said they must vote for who they said they're going to vote for, and that rule was then ruled unconstitutional?
There's a fair amount of history, and yes, there was a Supreme Court case. Let's see if we can break it down. Every state and the District of Columbia specifies how electors are chosen.
Right.
Some states require electors to take a pledge.
Okay.
To pledge to support the
eventual popular winner of that party.
And
or
again,
whatever.
if you assume that these electors are in effect chosen by the political parties, there's an additional layer of allegiance, if you will. I think most observers would say that if the states passed a law that said it is a crime not to fulfill your pledge, I think most observers would say that that criminality would be unconstitutional, because at the core of the Constitution, McGraw, is this notion that an elector is independent. But what the courts have held is requiring them to make a pledge is okay. It's that next step if there are consequences if they breach it.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, when the Constitution was officially written, didn't the electors come from the House of Representatives and the Senate? Isn't it a change from when it was? I mean, didn't they come from the Senate as opposed from the state?
No, the electors themselves may have largely been officials who were serving in Congress or the Senate,
right.
but the appointment has always rested with the state legislature.
Right, but something changed, right? I mean, the way we originally elected a president, wasn't there something that did they come from the House of Representatives?
Well, there's the mechanism. If someone fails to get a majority of the Electoral College,
right,
then it goes to the House of Representatives to pick the president, and it goes to the Senate to pick the vice president. That happened in 1800, 1876 with the horrible, the mess with Tilden, but the plenary power is vested in the state legislature, and it became, if you will recall, God forbid, if we go back to talk about the election of 2000, McGraw,
right.
But that was one of the big fights down in Florida. Was the Constitution says the legislature specifies these procedures,
right.
and the Florida Supreme Court decided that it was going to specify the procedures back then, and they got slapped down by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Each state decides how they award their electors, correct?
Yes. Each state legislature sets it up. 48 states and the District of Columbia, it's winner take all. Maine and Nebraska, there is a proportionality allocation. And so Clinton, as I recall, Clinton carried Maine, but Trump will get one electoral vote today from Maine.
Right. So if Missouri wanted to, they could decide to give their electors any way they wanted. They could do it through proportionality, through congressional districts. They could, if they so chose, give it to the popular winner of the country as opposed to the state, right?
Excellent point, McGraw. And it goes right to the core of what we were talking about a moment ago, and that is the federal Constitution grants a plenary power to the state legislatures to decide how that state's electors are to be chosen. And so with that plenary power, you are exactly right. The state legislatures would have, and do have, a very broad basis of authority to decide. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, all but two states
right.
Have decided it's winner take all.
Carl Bearden, former Speaker of the Pro Tem of the House, was on the show earlier, and he said the reason why they set it up this way was the power, the tyranny of the majority. What does he mean by that? And that's why the Founding Fathers set it up this way.
Well, there are two ways to look at it: tyranny of the majority, or the tyranny of the minority.
Thank you, because isn't it right? Because if there's a tyranny of the majority, then there's got to be a tyranny of the minority.
There's a tyranny of the minority to hold things up. For example, as we've seen in the United States Senate, the tyranny of the minority.
Right.
So, but I think a lot of scholars would say it had much to do about the South and the Southern states trying to protect slavery. I think the stronger reason was the one we spoke about a moment ago, and that is whether it's the passion of the majority, the tyranny of the majority, but for reasons other than the best interests of the nation, the majority would vote for candidate X.
Right.
And the thought was, well, the Electoral College would bring deliberative thought and consideration, and if necessary, override that passion of the body politic and pick someone else.
But, the argument is that California is so heavily populated, New York is so heavily populated that in this instance, how you count the votes, she's going to win the popular vote with more than 3 million votes. Obama won with, I think, 4.5, maybe 5 million, right? So she was approaching a very large victory, but she didn't get the votes in enough places.
Well, yes, and two thoughts on that. First, as happened in 2000 and is going to happen again today, a lot of bubbles of school children will burst when they thought, oh, mommy and daddy, we live in a democracy and the voters decide. Well, guess what, Sally and Dick, that's not what happens in America. Secondly, in defense of the Electoral College, I guess, let's use a football analogy.
Okay.
Hillary Clinton got more votes. Donald Trump will be elected president because of the Electoral College. Yesterday, there probably was an NFL football game, McGraw, where Team X won the game.
Yes.
And Team Y had more total yards.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Team Y fans say, well, we ought to be the winner of the game. We had more total yards.
Right.
Well, that's not the way it's set up. So similarly, the Clinton supporters would say, well, for goodness gracious, we had 3 million more votes than this guy.
Right.
Hillary ought to be president. Well, those aren't the rules. And what the Trump people would say is, well, if we knew those were the rules going in, we would have spent more time in California and less in Wisconsin.
I agree with that. I agree with that criticism completely. You would play a different game.
Completely different game.
You wouldn't care how many yards you totaled up. You would only care how many points you won.
Precisely.
Yeah, no,
precisely.
I agree with that. Stay right there because can you stick around for another
segment?
Sure,
I'd be glad to.
Greg Willard with us. What about the future of the Electoral College? The good, the bad, and the ugly. One of the best, Greg Willard, SLU law professor, as well as KTRS legal analyst, will continue here, and maybe a phone call or two, or a tweet or two, or a question at the E&B Granite text line.